Welcome to Healing the Spirit, a space where we awaken our creativity, deepen our connections, and remember who we are through the lens of astrology, archetypes, and art making. I'm your host, Jonathan Coe. Hello everyone, welcome to Healing the Spirit, and welcome to June. Here at the start of June, I'm inviting us to contemplate the theme of what it means to be led on an adventure by our questions and by our curiosities. So for many of us, especially those who went through the schooling system, we were taught to orient to questions in very specific ways. So questions generally come up in a couple ways. Questions come up when we are being asked to prove that we know what we're talking about, that we've assimilated the learning to a certain extent that allows us to then progress to the next level, right? In other words, questions are how we are tested. And questions also come up in terms of the learning process itself. When we are in classrooms, we are often invited to ask questions, but we quickly learn that not all questions are allowed, right? That questions can bring up certain reactions in others. And so questions are often not neutral. Questions, in a way, have sometimes been shaped as weapons that we use against one another. Questions are political in that sense because questions are what we use to determine who gets to pass and who gets to fail, or who gets respect and who needs to be put down. And so much of our being level, human level survival gets really wrapped up in trying to find the right answers. We pressure ourselves and we pressure one another to say the right things, to present in a certain kind of way, to signal that we are trustworthy or signal that we know what we're talking about. And we often also pressure ourselves to align with certain kinds of ideologies to secure our belonging. Right? And the reality is that life itself is often not that neat, and questions are really portals that lead us into deeper explorations. And similarly, answers don't always respond well to pressures, right? That in order to find the answer, sometimes we have to be willing to undergo a certain kind of journey. And that journey will lead us into transforming ourselves and becoming the kind of person who can be with those answers and who can embody those answers with every fiber of our being. We often apply this survival orientation to our spiritual and creative endeavors, right? All of us have found ourselves, especially when times get hard, we found ourselves looking to astrology, for example, to tell us the answers rather than to teach us how to shape better questions. We take classes, we develop intuitive abilities, we learn modalities to prevent sufferings rather than to allow it to increase our spiritual maturity and to learn to integrate the very human experience of pain or heartbreak or anger. We use tools like human design to decondition, but we neglect to recognize the sneaky ways that we still try to manufacture a pathway to be able to achieve a certain kind of mental conception of our best self, right? Rather than allowing our real intuitive selves to finally take the lead and to show us a fountain of wisdom that has always been there. On the path of being a mystic and on the path of being a creative, one inevitably reaches a point where there's an opportunity to take a left turn, to allow a different kind of work to start happening through us. We use different words to describe this moment. Some people would call these moments a turning point, which really is a term I like quite a bit because it carries with it a certain kind of neutrality, meaning it holds a question mark, right? Is it a sharp turn or is it a slow and gradual turn? Is it surprising or is it one that we've been anticipating for a while, right? There's a whole universe available when we conceptualize these moments as turning points. And some people would also use words like transformation or transition or change. And I personally get excited by these words. I like the idea that we are non-static beings. And at the same time, I recognize that it's easy for us to get carried away by these words because they do carry a certain mental invitation for us to foster ideas about what kind of transformation, what kind of transition, what kind of change is actually happening, right? Which may not be totally aligned with what is actually in front of us, right? The nature of a real transition is that we don't fully know what's on the other side. We are being asked to collaborate with the process itself, right? And sometimes we don't even fully know where we've been. Sometimes we don't even fully have the capacity to conceptualize the chapter that we are closing. And so the piece I mentioned earlier around allowing is very important here, right? The opportunity is to allow a different kind of work to start happening through us rather than kind of muscling our way to make the transition happen. In a way, true transformation, true transitions can't really be forced because it has its own intelligence, it has its own spirit, it has its own timeline. Sometimes the opportunity presents itself externally. Perhaps you're a musician who has been making a certain kind of music. Say you're a classical musician, and then you met a fellow musician who's a jazz person and you start jamming together, and before you know it, you start playing jazz, right? Perhaps you're a fiction writer and you are watching something on the news that got you curious and you started learning about this topic, and before you know it, you are writing a manuscript on the history of a topic you never even knew that you cared about. But perhaps the opportunity presents itself internally. Perhaps you suddenly want to orient to your life differently. Perhaps you woke up one morning and you decided you're ready to look for a new job. Perhaps you're ready to pick up a new habit, to start eating more vegetables or to start moving your body more. These moments can be potent moments of realignment. They present opportunities for us to reorient to our lives and our identity in a new way. These moments often inspire the question of what's happening here? Are we simply reorganizing the different pieces that has always been there in our lives? Or are we building something new altogether? Are we taking a break from what we were doing maybe before and indulging in a momentary exploration that somehow will help us find our way back to the previous thing with a new sense of vitality or vigor? Or are we really being asked to leave behind whatever it was that we were doing before? There's a lot of uncertainty. There can be a lot of questions and sometimes confusions as well in these moments. I've encountered many such moments in my life. I've encountered many turns of the phrase in the ever unfolding song of my life. And these moments can be really disorienting, right? You're often not sure what to do next. You can't tell what's 10 steps ahead of you, and it can make taking the next right step really overwhelming. All you see are options, right? And certainty feels very elusive. There's often a fair amount of agony in these moments, a fair amount of energy we spend on trying to answer the question of, should I fully commit to what's happening in front of me? What will happen if I leave behind the thing that I've built before, right? And underneath that, there's often this anxiety of missing our chance to get on the train that will take us on the ride of a lifetime, right? There can be this sense of a fear of missing out. And so what do we do in moments like this, right? What do we do? And especially this question becomes pertinent and relevant when we're ready to have a different way of orienting to our questions, right? When we're ready to no longer look to external crutches for a temporary sense of certainty that paradoxically will prolong the experience of being lost. It's making me think of one of my favorite quotes by Rilke. Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books that are now written in a very foreign tongue. Do not now seek the answers, which cannot be given you because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. In other words, our dear friend Rilke is reminding us that the answer has not been given to you, not because some higher power is trying to punish you, but because you're still learning how to embody this version of yourself that can actually meaningfully and fully live out the answer. The question I'm inviting us to ponder and to live into as we consider these moments of uncertainty, these areas of question marks in our lives, is who am I in the present moment? Who am I in the present moment? Not who am I based on what I have done in the past. Not who am I based on my fantasy of how my life should be moving forward. But really, who am I right now? Who's looking back at me from my reflections in the mirror? This is one of those potent questions upon which everything is built. Our willingness to be open to the answer without needing it to be the right answer or to force that answer to stay the same forever often can become the stepping stone that leads us into the right next step. This is also a deep question. And the question of who am I in general have led many seekers to lose their way in trying to find the answer. It's so funny that as I'm saying this, there's a super loud noise outside. Seems like there's a fire somewhere in here. I'm not laughing at the calamity, obviously. I'm just laughing at the reality that it can feel exactly like this, right? It can feel like there's a fire that needs to be put out. Who am I? Who am I? Right? Like that is often the energy with which people come to mystical studies when they're trying to figure out who they are, right? There's often a frenetic energy that people come to when it comes to trying to figure out their identity, right? And part of why that is quite simple. Part of why that is because who you are is always shifting, right? And so trying to lock it into place can be a fool's errand in a way, right? The moment you figure out who you are, the moment you have an elevator pitch of who you are and what you do, that's the moment when things start to evaporate, especially if you are dynamic beings, especially if you are someone who is really committed to paying attention to your life and paying attention to the world. The attraction or the pull of the past or the future is often more attractive than staying grounded in the present moment. Sometimes what stands between us and our ability to return to the present moment is paradoxically our willingness to not know, our willingness to experience what can feel like complete dissolution or confusion, right? Our willingness to essentially futz about in the dark woods of reality. The willingness to surrender to the winding path without demanding that our efforts or our virtues will lead us to any specific destination. A helpful beacon in these moments is a saying that is extremely famous by J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote, "Not all who wander are lost." And I was getting really curious about this particular quote, and I discovered that it came from a larger stanza. All that is gold does not glitter. Not all those who wander are lost. The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. So this quote is interesting, right? Because it actually is helping us to pause and essentially what this quote is really saying in the context of its larger stanza is that appearance can sometimes be deceiving. And while we know this to be true when it comes to social matters, right, where someone may present themselves a certain way but is not actually living the experience that they are projecting out into the world, right? This is something we're very familiar with now in the age of social media. This also applies to our internal journeys. That what appears to be the most challenging part of our path, the most challenging obstacle, may actually be our greatest teacher, right? What may appear to be our greatest weakness or our greatest point of vulnerability may actually be the gift that we bring out and bring forth into the world. Not all those who wander are lost also implies that there's a distinction between wandering and being lost. So what distinguishes the state of wandering and the state of being lost, right? Is it possible for us to wander and not be lost? And how do we discern the difference? When I look back at times in my life when I've been lost, something I've learned is that the state of being lost is a state of being ensnared in a fog of illusion, that somehow we are separate from the questions, that somehow there is this divide between us and the questions that we're asking, that somehow the questions themselves are outside of us, and therefore the answers are also outside of us. Which means then that the logical course of action would be to reach outwards, to find some semblance of security outside of the self. Those who are lost are those who have strayed from their own acknowledgement of their internal guidance. That this internal guidance is inherent, right? This internal guidance can't be taken away from us. And yet, if we lose touch with the essence, it can perpetuate this illusion of separateness. And those who are lost are entrenched often in their own idea of what the path needs to look like. In other words, those who are lost can walk their path with so much blind certainty. And so if you currently are in a moment of being lost, if you are currently in a moment of feeling lost, I encourage you to investigate. What did I expect out of life that life isn't giving to me right now? This experience, in a way, is so much deeper than disappointment. This experience is disillusionment. It's also a disarming of our own illusion that we can ever be in control. These feelings signify to us that we are actually, on some level, seeking an insurance policy from life. That we've been holding on to a belief that's rooted in fantasy, that if we just keep our end of the bargain, life will yield to our command, to our control. This illusion fabricates a problem that never is. It makes up a problem that on some level doesn't exist. A problem out of a gap that is actually natural. We see a gap and we think this gap needs to be filled. But rather, perhaps the gap invites a deeper exploration. Perhaps this gap, which can sometimes come up in the form of a question that seems unsolvable, perhaps is more like the hole that Alice fell into. Perhaps this gap is more like the tornado that sweeps Dorothy and Toto away from Kansas into the magical land of Oz. Those who are lost heard the horn and their fears immediately grip them. They think, oh no, is this a time for war? Has the enemy arrived? Am I going to be okay? How do I get out of this situation as quickly as possible? Right? That fear may show up as terror, or it may simply show up as a seemingly benign mental image. But that fear, when strongly held, when strongly adhered to, kind of becomes a religion, right? A religion built on expectations of what it means for us to be okay. That is not really rooted in reality, but it can feel impossible for us to see the ways in which it's not grounded, right? So just like in the case of Alice or Dorothy, this gap is actually an invitation. This gap is actually a call for adventure. And that's not to imply that there's anything wrong at all when fear comes. Fear is justified, actually, because We find ourselves in unknown territory here, right? We are at that turn of the phrase. We are at the changing of the tide. We don't know what's next in the symphony. We don't know if we're going to survive the next storm in the ocean of life, right? But what we do and how we hold ourselves during these moments absolutely matter. Perhaps there is such a thing as wandering with wisdom. Perhaps there is such a thing as wandering while allowing our heart to lead us. Perhaps there is such a thing as wandering as our willingness to be patient with what is unfolding. That perhaps the wandering is part of the answer itself. Perhaps it's possible to wander skillfully, to allow this wandering as a way to respect the reality that some answers require a genuine search. Some answers require surrender into the unknown. And the unknown is sometimes the big, vast landscape ahead of us. The unknown sometimes shows up as illness. Sometimes it shows up as a job that we've relied on for a long time that all of a sudden gets taken away from us. The unknown can look like a relationship that crumbles out of nowhere. A lover abruptly telling us they're done with the relationship, and we're left to wonder about what we did wrong. We're left only with the questions. The unknown can also be subtle. The unknown doesn't have to present externally. The unknown can be this internal posture of emptying oneself out of the assumptions, out of the expectations that certain outcomes need to happen within a certain time frame. How many times do we, out of innocent ignorance, hold life to a one-sided contract, asking it to give us what we believe we deserve? How many times do we internally speak to ourselves like this? I'm a good person who takes care of my health, right? I shouldn't get sick. Or I'm a hardworking employee. I shouldn't lose my job. I shouldn't be passed over for that promotion. I'm devoted to harmony in all of my interpersonal relationships. How could someone treat me badly, right? The phrase surrendering into the unknown can again bring up a mental image of someone who is being passive, someone who's not doing anything. But this image really betrays the reality that sometimes surrendering is a complex, dynamic process. And surrendering asks of us emotional maturity. Those who wander and yet resist the illusion of being lost are those who are willing to be in communication with the mystery. Not the mystery that they cultivate in their minds, but the mystery as it is at any given moment. Every moment is a mystery. Every moment is a perfect fractal of the divine. And sometimes the divine shows up as a question. Other times, the divine shows up as an answer. And sometimes the divine is something in between, right? Perhaps a temporary answer that we can play with until a more solid answer emerges. And certain answers ask us to first wander. And perhaps at certain points of our wandering, it behooves us to allow ourselves to feel lost, but to always remember that we in fact are not lost, that we are simply in process. An ally for this process is Jupiter. And as I'm recording this in early June, we are looking at Jupiter shifting into the sign of Cancer. Jupiter has been spending the last year in Gemini since May 25th, 2024, and the last transit that Jupiter will have before leaving Gemini is a conjunction with Mercury, which is in Gemini, and Mercury is at home in Gemini. This is significant because in contrast, Jupiter is in exile in Gemini. Here's a king that's been held captive in a foreign land far, far away from home. And as they're finally being released into Cancer, where Jupiter will be exalted, given resources and fame and access to a certain kind of power, Jupiter is receiving this benediction from Mercury. And Mercury is really the court jester, right? So there is an interesting reversal of role here. This stands in contrast with Jupiter transiting into Gemini back in May 2024. The first transit after Jupiter entered Gemini was a trine with Pluto in Aquarius. Jupiter and Pluto are both kings in the mythology. Jupiter is the king of the heavens, Pluto is the king of the underworld. And so Jupiter began this journey in Gemini with some illusion that their power and influence will work as expected, only to be humbled by the constant right-sizing, the constant humiliation, the constant pushing down closer into Earth that Jupiter is experiencing in the land of Gemini. And at the end here, Jupiter is finally learning how to take themselves less seriously, to begin really enjoying the journey as much as the destination. And Jupiter gets to have one last meal with Mercury, one that's perhaps humble and not lavish, yet full of laughter, full of good-natured trickery. I want to read you a fragment of something that I wrote at the start of Jupiter in Gemini for the zine that I was working on with Marika Clymer and Carolyn Egan, called Bodies of Land. And this was inspired by Jupiter in Gemini. So here's what I wrote. One could say that Jupiter is unconventionally, rather dismally resourced in Gemini. In Gemini, Jupiter, the head honcho of the gods in the Greco-Roman pantheon, who's used to big proclamations, is left in a messy room full of random newspaper articles from the past 100 years, some of which are torn in pieces and missing important segments. Jupiter possesses many virtues, but due diligence may not be one. The nature of Gemini is local, micro, and minute. Perhaps Jupiter in Gemini asks us to listen to the seemingly mundane, to honor the wild, unpredictable nature of reality. More presence, less planning, Jupiter whispers. Randomness as the mother of coherence. Chaos as the father of order. Jupiter in Gemini is a so-called greater benefic in their strangely gentle and gently strange guise. Perhaps there's no such thing as uniformity when it comes to wisdom. Perhaps the most relevant wisdom is local, amoral, emergent. The experience of gleaning wisdom during this transit might feel slightly chaotic. Certainly not the type to arrive in a neat Amazon box with free shipping that reliably comes once you hit the $35 minimum total order. Jupiter in Gemini is the emperor who walked into the make-believe universe of the court jester. The emperor couldn't help but be regal in his demeanors. And yet, just like in the emperor's new clothes, regality can't save you from the embarrassment of falling into the trickster's trap of being paraded naked for the whole town to see. While Jupiter is in Gemini, consider that your best ally might be an honest friend. Better yet, contemplate what it means to befriend honesty itself. If honesty were a person, what would they look like? How would they sound like? What would they wear? How would they like you to relate to them? Who would you become if you decide to begin wearing honesty as your first layer of clothing? The emperor might have saved himself the trouble if he were surrounded by honest men. Heck, the emperor might have saved himself the trouble if he were to trust his own knowing. Considering Mercury's rulership over the landscape of Gemini, the trickster will have much wisdom to share during Jupiter's stay in this terrain. Falling down and scraping one's knees often comes with the territory of an apprenticeship with the trickster. Ultimately, the trickster demands that humility not simply be a virtue, but also a tool at one's disposal for making it through life's winding path. Learning to tell facts from fiction is important. Learning when and how to rely on facts is just as important as learning when and how to rely on fiction, on parables, on imagined or perceived alternate realities. What you believe to be a distraction may be the destination after all. Not everything has to make sense. Not everything has to fit into the grander scheme of things. Sometimes you're only asked to listen to the wind, to allow your tiny toes to follow the strangely irregular thrum of your heart's gentle whispers. So, as Jupiter enters Cancer, Jupiter is bringing along this quality of recognizing that not everything can fit into the bigger picture. That sometimes one really has to surrender to the absurdity of life so that one can build the kind of character necessary to receive the answer. So I'll end this contemplation by sharing a small exercise that I found to be deeply helpful in moments of deep uncertainty or in moments of suffering. And this is from Awakening the Heart by Thich Nhat Hanh. This is a text that has been so dear to me as a companion in my path recently. And one of the questions that he posed was, what are the conditions we have for happiness? What are the conditions we have for happiness? And after that, he followed the question with this sentence: according to the Lotus Sutra, we are the heirs to many priceless jewels, but we wander around as if we were destitute children. In other words, what is in the way of your own innate access to happiness? Do you hold this belief that you need to achieve a certain kind of accomplishment before you can be a happy being? Do you hold the belief that you need to have a specific direction in life in order to feel joy? This passage really struck me when I first read it. It opened my eyes to the reality that joy and happiness are innate to us as human beings. When I think about my most beautiful memory, yes, there were these external stimuli that triggered my happiness. Perhaps I had just accomplished something I thought was impossible, or maybe I had a really meaningful conversation with someone I love, or maybe I just had an incredible meal, right? But the truth is that any one of these external things did not actually make me happy, right? My happiness came from within me. I was the one who unconsciously signaled to my body to create these happy hormones, whichever ones they may be, right? That joy I felt was really my own body unlocking a treasure that has always been there. And so I started journaling on this question every day. And I asked myself at the start of the day, what mental stories am I attaching to my joy and happiness? What do I believe I need to accomplish before I finally allow myself to feel joy and happiness? And I was surprised because the list of the conditions that I place on my joy and happiness is endless, truly. Every day there's a new one. More kept coming. But as I became aware of them, I began to surrender them into the void. It helped me practice remembering that joy and happiness are always just one choice point away from me. And to be clear, this is not to bypass pain, right? This is not to bypass suffering. As long as we are alive, we always have access to joy and happiness. But life also, of course, comes with its own set of sufferings. Life comes with pain. But they will not be alleviated through us clinging onto our denial of that inherent joy and happiness, right? Not allowing ourselves to feel that joy and happiness is not going to do any service whatsoever to that inherent suffering and pain that is a feature of being alive. So notice your attachment. Notice your attachment to these conditions that obscure your access to joy and happiness. And see what happens. See what happens when you observe them. And perhaps in observing them, you lighten your grasp on them. Or at least you give yourself the permission to laugh at yourself for holding on so tightly. All right, that's it by way of contemplation for the month of June. A couple announcements. The first one is the Creative Spirit reading are still available until the middle of June. And so if you would like to work with me one-on-one, if you are at a point in your creative path where you feel like some assistance from your creative spirit will be helpful for you, I would love to work with you. And I encourage you to book now if you are interested, because after this I will be taking a break and I'm not really sure if this offering will be available in the future or if I'll be doing it again. So this is the final call for this offering in this moment. And finally, the second announcement is on a container and an offering that I've been working on for some time, and that will begin before the end of 2025. It's an offering that has been with me for a number of years now, and it's been a transformative experience holding the frequency and allowing the spirit of this offering to shift me from the inside out. This offering is called Mystics of the Wandering Stars, and essentially what it is a 9-month container to explore what it means for each person who decided to join this journey, to explore what it means for them to be a mystic in the specific context of their life, in the specific context of their reality and their personality. And it is my belief that at this time, we are being asked to update the archetype of the mystic. We've inherited from previous generations the idea that the mystic has to be living this monastic life, that the mystic has to live a secluded existence from the rest of the world. And the premise of this container is to explore what it means to practice being a mystic in our daily lives, in every aspect of our lives, and to allow that practice, that devotion, that commitment to start shifting us from the inside out. And if this feels exciting to you, for some of you, this might be a point of attraction. I will let you know that we have 7 guest teachers in this container, which are the planets. We will learn what it means to be a mystic through the lens of the moon, the sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. And throughout the course of the 9 months, we are really setting our sight and setting our intention on rebirthing our inner mystic and seeing what emerges out of that exploration. So if this sounds exciting to you, registration will not be open for some time, but you can sign up for the waitlist, and I will make sure that you receive the news when you will be the first ones to receive the news. Okay, that is it from me. Thank you very much for being here with me. I am so grateful and so honored for your time and your attention, and I hope to see you soon, and I'm sending you so much love as you walk your path in June. Take care.